Well, hey everyone, it's the Eurobandit here once again, and in this video we're gonna be talking about Technics. Quick story before we start. I started this hobby collecting hi-fi stereo components from the 70s and 80s in around 2012. Even a few years before that, I got my very first Technics setup, which was a mix between different eras. I got my very first Technics setup in around 2007 or 2008. The story goes like this. Back in the mid-2000s I had one of those typical modern stereo systems. It was nothing fancy, it wasn't a Sony or a Philips with demo or the fancy ones from the late 90s to mid-2000s. The silver typical plastic junk. But all those LEDs, lighting effects, and the CD changer, all those features made people love them. But the quality on the other hand was a piece of crap. Well, I didn't have one of those fancy ones, but it was certainly in that range. It had a 3-disc changer, double cassette deck, and so on and so forth. Of course, I wasn't really happy with it because even though I was a child in that time, I still realized it was a piece of shit. Not just from the sound perspective, but overall cheap build quality and so on and so forth. Even the expensive ones were pretty crappy. Some of them did last for like 10 years or so, but it was the time when this consumerism pretty much started, so people just didn't keep their stuff as they used to back in the day. Prior to that system, I used to see some of the older systems running. Even when I was visiting somebody, I would just hear the sound and I was like, wow. But what really got me into this hobby was this, well, not this particular example, but this model of a receiver, Hitachi SR2000. This is what started it all back in around 2006, when I realized that, wait a minute, the 80s stereo systems were and are and will always be superior to any other modern junk. A little receiver like that was so freaking capable that it would shake the whole house. With just a pair of regular speakers from the same era, I was really impressed. It was pretty much shortly after I got that fancy modern stereo system when I saw a receiver like this. In that time it was garbage picked. So shortly after that, in around 2007 or 2008, I actually traded in that so-called fancy modern junk stereo system with my very first Technics stereo setup. But that's not when my hobby really started, but I was really happy that I had that thing. I might make a separate video on this story. In around the mid to late 2000s, especially the mid-2000s, people collectively decided to get rid of their electronics from the 70s, 80s and 90s. So you would find those things at the dump all the time. You would constantly see people throwing away VCR players, amplifiers, receivers. Some, a lot of these electronics were even high-end. These days they are worth a lot, but in that time people just saw them as old, outdated garbage. Long story short, I was sort of happy with my Technics setup, although it wasn't the ideal setup, because it was a mix between the 80s and 90s, and I'm really not a fan of the 90s hi-fi. To me, the late 80s is where I draw the line, because in the 90s, usually it's when the quality has gone down. And I'm going to explain you what I mean later on in this video. And I've had Technics stuff pretty much from all the eras, from the 70s, 80s, and even early 2000s. That includes both amplifiers, receivers, as well as audio-video receivers from the surround era. I have experience and I can tell you all about it. This is my current setup. If you watched my older videos, you would see that I had way fancier components compared to what I have here. The reason is I sold all of those and I decided to go for the 70s Pioneer hi-fi stuff, which I still have, but Technics is always going to be special for me, so I decided to buy these things. Let me tell you the story of why I have this amplifier and all this setup. I was looking to create my ideal Technics setup, which this is not, but I wanted to start off by buying an equalizer, because I had this exact same equalizer. If you look in one of my older videos, the SH8046, which has these touch controls, really fancy for that era. However, these things alone are usually quite expensive these days, so I had a really great deal around 4 years ago, almost 5 years ago. It was on an auction site. I found this equalizer, this amplifier, the CD player, as well as the cassette deck, all of these in one auction. And this is my SL-Q2 direct drive automatic turntable system. Really nice. It's from the late 70s, but it's really modern, because if someone isn't familiar with these models, they could tell it might as well be from the mid 80s or even late 80s, because it goes so well together with the rest of the 80s stuff. This amplifier is from the early 90s, and unfortunately here is where the quality has sort of gone down. It still looks nice, it still got the legendary Technics shape. It was around the mid 90s, around 94 to 95, when they started having like the more round faceplate, such as this one. As you can see, this isn't even that round. Some of them were even more round, but you can pretty much see how round it is around here. It's got the modern knobs. This particular receiver is just an example. Just pulled it out of the storage just so I can show you how the more modern ones look like. This thing is far newer. It's from either 99 or 2000, but they pretty much remained the same since the mid-90s, design-wise, with the screens, with the knobs and everything else. They just added more and more features. In my opinion, the best era of Technics is the 70s stuff, such as these receivers, the cassette deck. This is pretty much the 70s / very early 80s stuff up until the late 80s. Some of the very late 80s models were also continued until 1990, but shortly after that, like the early 90s, was the beginning of their decline, in my opinion. And what I mean about decline is, especially when it comes to these amplifiers, is the sound quality. These early 90s Technics amplifiers, they still do have decent quality. However, they lack a lot when it comes to sound, especially bass. You shouldn't need to use an equalizer just to improve the sound. I mean, I love having equalizers just because they're fancy, especially this model. But a good quality amplifier or receiver should have that beautiful warm sound of the 70s and 80s, which doesn't require an equalizer or anything else just to sound decent. Now, everyone else has different tastes, but in my opinion, it should sound perfect from the start. The equalizer, sure, you can just like play with it every now and then, but it shouldn't be necessary. I mean, might as well have it on flat. I don't really use it, but I really like this thing because look, you can just slide it, and it's very touch sensitive, which I like. And then you have the spectrum analyzer, and these buttons are also touch buttons apart from these ones. You can even display it like this or like this. And then around the mid-90s came, the faceplate started becoming round, such as this one, and they pretty much stay the same. Like I said, there's even more round models like this one. I had a amplifier which I had in my very first setup, the faceplate was even more round than this one. I'm not a fan of this design. They kept this design until around the early 2000s, until Panasonic decided to no longer make Technics stuff, and then they just suddenly disappeared from everywhere. But speaking of that mid-90s amplifier, this early 90s one actually sounds acceptable. It's not good, I mean it's not to my preference, but it's still far better than the newer stuff. And also the overall quality has declined ever since they started making the so-called round faceplates. Even had the fancy cassette decks with the doors which have mowers you can just open and close. Those are just a bunch of modern features which are basically, in my opinion, mostly show-off stuff. The less fancy features it has, the more it's gonna last. I don't mind auto reverse and digital counters such as this one. I don't mind it. But I even had the cheapest 80s receiver from Technics. It had a tape input, phono input, integrated tuner, and that's about it. It didn't even have an auxiliary port, but the sound it made, the quality of that sound made me impressed. Try that with the mid to late 90s Technics receivers. And generally the 90s was the era of pretty much all the electronics. Quality-wise, they have gone down. Some of them kept their standard, such as the Pioneer reference series, the ones that had copper frames, wooden side panels, really shiny. The quality was really great. I have a friend that, at least a few years ago, he used to collect the most fancy stuff from everything. Even Sony has made a few of those high-end ones, which look similar. Technics, on the other hand, kind of fell behind. But of course that era of those separate hi-fis will die anyway. But if you're into those more modern hi-fi systems from the 90s and you want something high-end that sounds nice and looks nice, yeah, I'd recommend you going for the reference Pioneer stuff. However, they're going to be very expensive, so you need to have a thick wallet for that. However, if you want an 80s stereo setup, definitely the Technics is the pinnacle of that era. I even have several older friends that say the same thing about this Technics stuff. I hear stories from a lot of people, even radio stations using Technics stuff in the 80s. Really powerful, really good quality. 70s as well, I mean, these are not fancy models which I have here, but you didn't have to buy anything fancy in that time if you wanted something quality. All of them were great, from the cheapest to the most expensive when it comes to Technics from the 70s and the 80s. Now we're coming into the surround era. You had several options in the 90s. You will see more and more of these things into people's homes. Same thing, when it comes to sound, I'm talking about stereo. I'm not into surround. I've never been into surround. I mean, when you watch a movie and you have a 5.1 or 7.1 setup with a subwoofer, yeah, I mean, it's cool to watch a movie, but when it comes to music, it's totally worthless. If you don't have a subwoofer, these things are not going to impress you. And I've had AV receivers from Pioneer and Technics, especially from the 90s, because I wanted to see how they are, how they perform, and so on and so forth. But really, I'm not into these things when used in stereo. This surround stuff is also part of this so-called consumerism market, because in the 90s you had the Dolby Pro Logic, and then it was like replaced several times, THX, 5.1 channel, 7.1 channel, and basically if you have an older surround system and you buy a DVD with the 7.1 sound, they're pretty much incompatible with each other. And that's why these things, even the premium ones, because I used to have a premium one, which had those sound level needles. As you can see, this thing has regular audio video inputs and outputs. Shortly after came the high definition, then the full high definition, and these things were obsolete. So to wrap it all up, the 70s and 80s Technics is superior. The early to mid 90s is when the decline happened in both quality and especially sound quality. If you want to get yourself a Technics setup or get yourself into Technics, and if you want to know which era is the best, it all depends what your preferences are. If you want extremely great build quality, that beautiful warm hi-fi sound and simplicity, then definitely go for the 70s. If you want it to be a little bit more sophisticated but still excellent quality, then pretty much everything from the 80s. If you're more into those fancy stuff, if you like that, mini discs, a bunch of fancy features and stuff, then you can pretty much go for the 90s. You have two choices when it comes to the 90s. You either have the round faceplate or the classic square faceplate. Don't get me wrong, I don't say that the more modern Technics stuff from the mid to late 90s is trash, because it's not. It's far superior than a lot of other things that you could find in that era. However, like I said, the older stuff is just simply superior. And one thing I like about this Technics stuff, no matter which era it's from, whether it's from the 70s, 80s, 90s and even early 2000s, they all have this legendary brown color. You could also get these things in silver, both in the 70s and in the 80s. When it comes to the 80s stuff, the silver stuff wasn't really popular, so people mostly bought them in this color. Again, one thing I really like about the Technics is that it's really easy to distinguish which era a particular model is from by simply looking at the power button. This square typical power button, which is this color, is mostly from the mid to late 80s. Then came the early 90s, 1990, 1991. You had this type of button. And this type of power button stuck throughout the rest of the production. And of course the 70s stuff usually have this flip power on and off. Some of them also have push buttons. So with all that being said, now I'm gonna end this video. Hope you liked it. If you did, why not thumbs up? Check out my other videos, and if you like what I'm doing, why not subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Cheers!